Cyberpunk 2077 has a grand total of 7 different Cyberdecks to choose from, each sporting their own sets of buffs and abilities to encourage a wide variety of net-running builds. In this video, I looked at all of them to figure out each of their main strengths and construct a build heavily leaning into those. From the all-powerful Purerunner with endlessly overclocked feedback loops to the toxically explosive brain-melting builds that can drop a crowd of enemies in literally 2 seconds. Whatever kind of netrunner you want to be, I'm sure you'll enjoy at least one of these builds. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's kick things off with the original deck we get at the start of the game. The Biotech Paraline is the deck best optimized to combine quick hacks with smart guns into a build we'll appropriately name the Netgunner. What I like about this one is it's not purely about chaining quick hack combos involving just as much gunplay as hacking, and perfect for anyone wanting a very balanced hybrid of the two. Perks-wise, you of course want to spec mostly into intelligence, aiming for eventually the full 20 attributes. That's a staple for all these builds, but perks-wise, this one is particularly intelligence weighted, as each of the 3 trees play a major role: Qs, overclock, and smart guns. With top tier perks unlocking quick hack Q lengths with the power to instantly drop anyone, the chance for powerful hacks to spread to multiple targets, and instant smart gun target lock when in overclock mode. Going through the game, I'd say spec intelligence points at a 2-to-1 ratio with this, hitting 20 int around level 30, whilst catching up more slowly with body, reflexes, and tech. For tech, you want to prioritize cyberware perks earlier on, and eventually heals to better survive firefights. Air dash from reflexes will be genuinely really useful here, as we're going to be dashing around, smart gunning everyone, whilst for body, you just want some health regen to aid in overclock and combat. I'll be linking build planner perk guides to all of these down below, by the way. Cyberware wise, this is less net running heavy than most of the others, with X-Disc and Memory Boost to offer some decent combat hacking aids, and Self-Ice to prevent us from getting hacked. This is a more frantic, explosive build where we won't really have time to specifically hunt down netrunners. Then there's Monowire, of course, which gains up to 30% extra damage with this deck. I went with the thermal one, as it synergizes with contagion, though electrical is an alternative that could be a more thematic fit with this build. Smart Link as well, as all our guns are smart, and auto healing along with heal on kill, which will be another staple for every build. After that, there's a heavier focus on combat aids here, given the gunning nature. The newer Phoenix and Cogito Lattice from 2.1 are both practically designed for this style of play, whilst Chitin's health regen will specifically help with overclock and staying alive in general. After that, just try and fill every cyberware slots for a reduction in cyberware cooldown with the cyborg perk. Weapons are very important to this one, and even without speccing into specific weapon perks, I think you'll find smart guns specifically are more than mighty enough still with this build. I took Yinglong as our primary, dealing with any singular opponents alongside the Monowire. Yinglong can be found at a suspected crime down here in Wellsprings. Divided We Stand is then looted from the Stadium Love quest in Rancho Coronado, and that's more for dealing with crowds at a greater distance, emitting puffs of poisonous gas. Finally, the Bajing Chong is an explosive final stand option, used when utterly surrounded to carve us an exit or just look really cool. Though, that can only be obtained from the Ebenike in Northside after completing at least one game ending. Additionally, you'll want to equip thermal grenades, again, to proc explosions from contagion. Finally, the quick hacks of this build are designed to offer combat aid and compound the effects of our guns. Adding them in this particular order as well, I found to be very easy to navigate. Ping is great here for surveying the battlefield and improving our target lock. Cyberpsychosis can grant us additional temporary allies. Cripple movement can pin enemies in place to prevent them from taking cover, whilst weapon glitch can actually improve our gun's crit chance. Contagion, of course, does blanket damage when we're outnumbered, and can be followed up with the Monowire or incendiary grenades to proc a devastating burn effect. Equally, the Shingen Mark V prototype is an ideal gun for this too, though that's another build coming up later. Finally, Cyberware Malfunction, Short Circuit, and Synapse Burn will be our heavy-hitting combo to immediately drop anyone particularly strong, so add them in this order to get those 3 at the top to easily scroll through. One other great quick hack here would be Detonate Grenade, but as I said in the Quick Hacks Ranked video, as of 2.11, that hack doesn't seem to work properly. If it does ever get fixed, I'll pin it in a comment below, in which case maybe switch out Weapon Glitch for it, or perhaps Cyberpsychosis. Other than that, there's a fair amount of diversity to this build. It's not the most powerful thing on the list, especially when it comes to the hacking elements, but like I say, it's very fun, very loud and explosive, and gives you a taste of several different game mechanics. Up next, at the opposite end of the spectrum, the Arasaka deck is a stealth-optimized piece designed for sneaking around and avoiding detection at all costs. Let's call it the Shadowrunner, with a cheaper cost for covert hacks, bonus RAM for performing takedowns, and a ton of trace-reducing qualities. For perks this time, we're trading out smart weapon efficiency, but keeping most of the 2 other int trees. Also buying up perks to specifically boost stealth, such as Shadowrunner, which happens to have the same name as the build, though the most cool one here is copy-paste, which can spread your hacks through a Netrunner to multiple enemies. After that, we want health regen, air dash, and cyberware tech, much the same as before, with the big change this time being cool perks. Predominantly the sneak sprint tree with perks like Vanishing Act, as well as these small ones down here to boost stealth takedowns. Cyberware this time is a lot more fragile, with most of our armor traded out, instead taking RAM reallocator to make our standard RAM go a lot further. Combat is generally a lot slower with this build, and less optimized for quickly taking everyone down in one use of overclock. Optical camo, of course, will be crucial, whilst Korenzikov and Cortex support can aid in the odd stealth headshots we're gonna use here. Speaking of, weapons aren't particularly needed for this build, though a powerful silenced pistol can occasionally save us when caught out on low RAM. The most powerful in the game is Rogue's Pride, but before completing the sun ending to get it, you could alternatively use Her Majesty from Phantom Liberty, or else just a regular Nue or Tameyoda. Take a skim through Pistols Ranked for more on that, or Throwing Knives are another excellent alternative. The true power here though will come from our stealth hacks, which I would recommend adding in this particular order. With Short Circuit and Synapse Burn on the end to be scrolled straight back to, chained with Memory Wipe, this will be our backup stealth combo to be used in overclock mode, with Synapse Burn then extending that effect. Request Backup can move people if there's no nearby devices to cast distract enemies on, whilst Ping is just good for general surveillance. System Collapse is our big stealth sucker punch, but it is kind of expensive, only to be used in overclock or with a discount unlocked whilst reducing traces. A great method with this is to shoot next to a Netrunner, triggering a trace, then upload this to drop them and all nearby allies. Just don't take the iconic of this one, as last I checked, it's bugged. Tier 5 is fine though. Our main combo though will be Tier 4 Memory Wipe, Tier 2 Reboot Optics, and Tier 5 or above Sonic Shock. Uploading these in that order procs basically a cheaper System Collapse, highly effective against everyone, including some bosses. This was the basic attack I used in this build, so it makes sense to load it up last and have it at the top. Overall, the Shadowrunner is a fun stealth challenge and saves a lot on armor and toughness perks, though bear in mind there are certain missions and boss fights where stealth really isn't an option. Fantastic if you're planning on binging through most of the gigs and scanner hustles say, but you'll probably want to switch this up a bit before something like Don't Fear the Reaper. A crazier, more hands-on alternative to the Netgunner build next, the Biotech Sigma buffs damage over time combat hacks, specifically encouraging a pairing with the monowire. This makes for an optimal and explosive contagion overheat build, which I've taken to calling Brainmelter. This time just speccing slowly into the Q and overclock trees, and this is a build viable from a bit earlier in the game, not necessarily demanding long queues of hacks to work best. After this, we want cyberware and heals, then spec more heavily into air dash and body regen perks, leaving cool, once again, right down for this build. If you do have any perks left over, then add them to smart weapons, though this will be predominantly monowire focused, so it doesn't matter too much. For cyberware, self-defense is a big priority here, as this is the most up-close and personal net-running build, with zero prospects for stealth. Self-ice, again, will defend us from hacks. Chitin should regen a fair amount of health, whilst shock and awe and micro-generator are some nice electric cherry-style defense mechanisms. Weapons for this one are predominantly the thermal monowire, although in backup a very good thing to have is the Shingen Mark V prototype, looted from a storage container at the back of the Arasaka compound in Rancho Coronado. This is the best gun for adding the flame effect of contagion and detonating enemies, but only worth doing after a large group of them are already infected. For the most part, we want to merely be laying into burning or poisoned enemies with our monowire. As for hacks this time, there's cyberware malfunction, short circuit, and synapse burn, return again for our endless overheat loop, but I'd only use that if retreating from the fight for a second as a last resort escape kind of thing. In fact, losing all our health to overheat really isn't optimal with this build in particular, with the Sigma more designed to enhance our splash damage over time hacks, both in duration and damage. Activating overclock is more in aid of extending contagion or overheat than freeing up RAM to use. Obviously, the two most important hacks to this build then are contagion and overheat, the two it's made to be used with. Alongside this, I added cripple movements to hold bosses in place so that we can use overheat to slowly melt their armor and, well, brains. And finally, that one, self-destroy? Figuring that given it gets a cost reduction after applying melee finishes, it can be an occasionally effective and sadistic way to cheaply deal with the odd foe. Just don't waste your RAM on it at full price. Also make sure to load a copy of cripple movement onto the monowire as well. So where this build thrives is either in the middle of a shorter fight, throwing out contagions, overheats, and monowire attacks, or else in smaller ones, against a few tougher enemies or a boss. A master at whittling down health over time and holding people in place. Though in the big law enforcement max hack style battles, I would say there are certainly stronger Netrunner builds than this. The Netwatch NetDriver makes for an interesting build, encouraging us to use the surrounding environment to deal with people in all sorts of creative ways, buffing us for uploading hacks via devices like cameras. What's beautiful about this is we can potentially take out an entire enemy base whilst never setting foot inside. The issue is it's pretty much designed purely for cases where there are devices to hack and somewhere nearby to hide. We'll be very fragile with this build and not really good in combat, but through the power of machines, we will be a god. Perks-wise, it's again the first two inst trees, with anything boosting the hacks themselves, and nothing for the physical world. No guns, no takedowns. For cool, we'll be taking the sneak tree, as that'll still often be a necessity. Tech is again cyberware and heals, air dash can still be useful in certain terrain, and of course health regen. Cyberware is a lot more bare bones here, as we ideally won't be fighting, so it's pretty much just the RAM boosts and health for overclock mode, as well as optical camo, of course. Weapons, like I say, will barely be used, but anything silenced you might as well grab. I'm using the same ones as the Arasaka build loadout, but basically anything strong and quiet to fire as a last resort. Finally, hacks then are very similar again to the Arasaka loadouts, but since there's less sense in moving enemies out of our way, I switched request back up for cyberpsychosis for the more fun option of making them fight one another. Self-destroy is also an alternative option to that, but not quite as economical given we won't be reducing it with melee finishes. Also takes cyberware malfunction in place of short circuit to reduce the cost on that cyberpsychosis. Other than that, it's similar hacking methods to the Arasaka build, just with a priority of being either through cameras or vehicles. See, with the car hacker perk, we can do the very cool thing of controlling vehicles, and if we dare not set foot into a group or a base but there aren't many well-placed cameras, we can just send a bike as our envoy, administering hacks from that whilst keeping ourselves safe. And I mean, sure, this isn't an option for certain places. This build relies on either cameras or road access and wouldn't work in Don't Fear the Reaper, for example. But if you're looking to play around with a build totally different from anything else in this game, a means by which to cheese enemies with their own vehicles whilst making them battle themselves, then the God of Machines build is well worth giving a go. This next one has a very specific means by which it works properly, and it's also only accessible through a certain ending to Phantom Liberty. But the Biotech Canto, with everything set up around it perfectly, could just be the most powerful build in the game, which I've taken a name after one of its most important perks, Blood Demon. Buy up this and pretty much all the other main perks from Intelligence, mostly avoiding just stealth and monowire. And if you've got some points left over, then grab up the remaining smart ones too. It goes without saying this is entirely an endgame build, as we only get the deck towards the end of the game. No call points at all for this one, so buy up Edgerunner for more cyberware lenience, though not too much, as we'll need most of our health for the build. Then heavy on air dash perks, including gun ones, and a few for regen too. Again, build planners for this part down below. The base cyberware is similar to the other strong builds, with mostly armor, heals, and damage mitigation that we can afford, and importantly the RAM reallocator. You might think the cybersomatic optimizer would be be a good idea, but given the deadliness of the Blackwall hack already, I'd just save that 50 cyberware. Weapons-wise, it's mostly gonna be dashing about with the Yinglong just for suppressing fire, but Bajing Chong is great to shoot into opportune clusters. Third can be whatever you like, I chose Ogu. Now, the method of using this is important, but kinda simple, and mostly revolves around these 3 hacks. I'd recommend dropping 3 tier 2 reboot optics on one enemy, and finally a Blackwall gateway. This will make it much cheaper and upload much faster. Once that's done, trigger the overclock and get to work mostly just doing the same chain, but with Synapse Burn instead on the end, which itself will extend the duration of overclock to keep spreading that Blackwall gateway, and once it's hit all 5 targets, if anyone's still alive, just set off another Blackwall chain, all the while frantically searching for targets to hit with the Synapse Burn chain. If they're skull level or above, then maybe switch optics for cyberware malfunction to ensure that we get the Synapse Burnout kill, and for max tac, that's gonna be a necessity, as they're immune to reboot optics. Short Circuit can also be added earlier on in the chain though for bosses like that, to proc even more damage before they get hit with Gateway. Of course, this soul harvesting feedback loop only works if there's souls. Without them, the overclock ends, and you'll have to just dash around laying down suppressive fire until ideally it's recharged. Successfully mastering that method though can, barring any utterly terrible luck, allow you to survive any number of enemies, any number of max hack squads indefinitely. It's a bit repetitive after a while, admittedly, though exceptionally powerful. Raven Microcyber allows us to be a lot of things, but the main hack that it enhances is Contagion. Uploading to all potential enemies at once, it'll hit at the same time rather than sequentially. Designed exclusively really to face down groups of foes, making our hacks spread further and proccing a lot of AoE. This build is fairly similar to our Netgunner, but rather than a 50-50 split of hacking and guns, let's call it 65% on the hacking side, with again all 3 int trees, but drop some of these smart perks instead into copy-paste, as hitting Netrunners with this deck, well, then it's again cyberware, heals, air dash, and regen, with Adrenaline Rush 2 this time, as we won't be specced quite as heavily into defensive cyberware. Trading out the cyberware for chitin this time for the Cyber Somatic Optimizer, as we want to get maximum damage with our virally spreading hacks. Speaking of, I couldn't quite decide on the name for this build, and wound up torn between Fatal Virality or Crowdkiller. Comment below which you prefer, or if you just have something better. Anyway, other than that, I had similar staples to the Netgunner, with Parabellum an especially great choice for armor, as it adds an additional 13% to our overall rating. I went with Counter Shell in place of chitin to mitigate dramatic health drops, but Range Guard and Proxy Shield alternatively offer flat extra defense at long and close range, respectively. Weapons are also important to this build, with our key one being the Shingen Mark V, to detonate all those contagion effects, which will have spread a lot faster with this deck. Alternatively, the Xmod 2 Kappa provides some versatility in that it can be modded, and I'd recommend the Head Hopper mod found randomly as loot or from vendors, or the Hecatomy mod crafted from the Chimera core. The gun can be looted from up in Luxor Heights behind a barrier near this sculpture, but only after completing the Spy in the Jungle gig. Other than that, Yinglong is excellent at picking people off, with Bajing Chong, Divided We Stand, or the Barghest Warden, all decent alternatives to switch up with too. Just don't trade out the Mark V, anything else can be mixed and matched. As for hacks, well, there's obviously Contagion, and whilst the Mark V will be applying Overheat most of the time, the hack is good to have in reserve. Cyberware Malfunction, Short Circuit, and Synapse Burn will, as usual, allow for an unlimited overclock feedback loop, though that's really only necessary in very tough situations. For the most part, it'll be blanket damage to everyone. Self-Destroy, it's not called that, but you know what I mean, is good to have in backup too, because of the high chance that it spreads to multiple targets with this. Then, finally, Bait and Request Backup are perfect for grouping everyone together before a fight breaks out. Chaining Bait, then Request Backup onto an enemy will summon up to 5 of their nearby allies to their location, after which simply hit them with a Contagion and unload the Shingen Mark V. A highly effective and speedy way to deal with smaller groups immediately. And as for larger bases, that's when you want to throw out some Synapse Burn loops over a lengthy use of overclock, all the while still hitting everyone with Contagion and generally following up with the Mark V. itself. Against other law enforcement, well, this build can get rid of a swarm of police about as quickly as the Blood Demon one, though this deck of course is available far earlier and isn't contingent on certain Phantom Liberty choices. Plus, the general explosion effect from Contagion looks awesome. It does run the risk of running out of RAM more, but that's where supportware like Yinglong comes in. For shorter fights though, i.e. if you're grinding scanner hustles, well, I don't know about you, but doing stuff like this made me feel pretty damn awesome. Finally then, we come to arguably the most powerful Netrunner build in the game in terms of pure net running qualities. There's absolutely no hybridization for this build, generally not leaning into quirks like controlling vehicles and hacking people that way, though that's not out of the question, but the Tetratronic Rippler, instead, with its huge RAM capacity, enables what we'll call the Purerunner, and it optimizes itself in all the best hacking methods we've been using through this video, functioning great both from stealth and in open combat. The most versatile build of them all, though potentially eventually repetitive and not as satisfying as some of the others. Probably the least demanding build perks-wise given the lack of hybridization, with int perks here purely focused into hacking itself with no smart gun stuff or monowire. Sneaky perks purely to allow us to stealth around quicker when relevant. Somewhat light then on the cyberware perks, we can't afford to fill the slots to benefit from cyborg or chrome constitution, so switch those into buffing heals instead. Air dash, you can avoid any gun-based perks and spec a little more heavily into health regen. It's gonna be all about the overclock with this build. Also, bear in mind for all of these, when running around in stealth, it may be worth unequipping the spillover perk if you plan to use overclock, just to stop things spilling over to a traceable enemy. For cyberware this time, we want both the cybersomatic optimizer and the RAM reallocator, since again, it's gonna be entirely about the hacks here. RAM reallocator will restore about half our RAM every 15 seconds at high levels to ensure we always have plenty, even outside overclock, whilst the optimizer will permanently deal crits, which is even more effective against high-level enemies like MaxTac, adding monowire too, just in case, optical camo for stealth, and RAM recoup from skeleton will actually give us even more RAM and regenerate some when we get hit. This of course leaves little room for armor, but the idea here is to drop everyone quickly enough that we shouldn't need any. Weapons then, like I say, totally unimportant. Again, a powerful silenced pistol or Yinglong might come in handy on the odd occasion, but hacks is what it's all about, and I'm gonna keep it very, very simple with those. You can fill in the remaining gaps yourself with combos from other builds, whether that's Contagion or Overheat, Bait and Request Backup, or any of the 4 ultimate quick hacks to spice things up a bit. The Purerunner is actually pretty versatile in the hacks it can use, but its core function is comprised of Short Circuit, Cyberware Malfunction, Tier 4 Memory Wipe, and Synapse Burn. You can save a couple RAM with Tier 2 Reboot Optics potentially, but that's unnecessary extra, I would say. And there are 2 or 3 modes, 2 or 3 combinations that use these core hacks. In stealth, I would say generally just drop the quick hack chain in the arranged order: Memory Wipe, Short Circuit, Cyberware Malfunction, then Synapse Burn. Whilst in open combat, you could either, against most low-level enemies, do triple Cyberware Malfunction, then 1 Synapse Burn, whilst against MaxTac or bosses, you'll want to switch the second hack in that chain out for Short Circuits, placing it there in the queue for optimal synergy with both the hack's own buff of 25% extra damage and the Rippler exclusive one of 40%. Also note that triggering Overclock with this deck will hit every enemy within 8 meters with Reboot Optics and Weapon Glitch, so generally worth running towards people before doing that. Overall, whilst this build is the most powerful then, it's not necessarily the quickest. It doesn't spread very well, and generally each enemy needs to be hit individually with the quick hack chain. Also, its true power isn't entirely viable until late into the game, so in the meantime you might want to go with a more low-level effective build like the Brainmelter or the one that uses the Microcyber. But again, there's some space left open on this one to incorporate certain elements of those builds into this as well, with more RAM on this deck and excellent regeneration in the build, making the Rippler extremely versatile with anything else we've looked at today. So comment below which of these 7 builds you would prefer to run with and why, and also tell me any additions or changes you would make to potentially improve them further. Massive thank you, as always, to the patrons for keeping the channel alive, supporting me to make more content for you guys to enjoy and learn from. I'm Bram, and I'll see you in the next one.